dealing with oneness is really a personal practice of changing the way that we see the world and the way we form constructs in our head. It's not just like, I'm going to form an idea of what oneness is and talk about that externally, because that's automatically like internal and external are still separate. So the Fourier transform showed me, and I think it continues to show, the mathematics of how the world can be seen not separated into parts. Because if you take that sound, waveform in music, and you have the beginning of the song and the end of the song as separate parts in time, in the Fourier transform world, those are not separate pieces of the song. They're mixed together. So there's this automatic holism that shows up when you apply the Fourier transform. And it's present in a lot of physics, actually, but not really recognized.
I think we all had, in one form or another, experiences that appear to be meaningfully related, yet lack a causal connection. For example, you were thinking about an old friend, and the next moment or the next day, this person was just calling you out of the blue. In this episode, we talk all about this strange phenomenon and how it can be scientifically explained. Today's guest is Skye Nelson-Isaacs. He's a theoretical physicist, speaker, musician, and author of multiple books. He has a master's degree in physics from San Francisco State University with a thesis in string theory and a bachelor degree in physics from UC Berkeley. He has sought for over 2 decades to establish a connection between synchronicity, physics, and real life using research and original ideas. In this episode, Skye and I have a powerful conversation about how things like synchronicities and flow can be explained scientifically. So I hope you enjoy this podcast with Skye.
So, Skye, you know what? You're actually I studied physics as well, and you're the first physicist I'm speaking since probably, like really speaking in depth since probably 5-6 years. I've been on a journey of where I deep dived into. I studied physics, and then I went to business, and then I went to Asia, studied Asian philosophy, Taoism, Qigong. So and reading your bio, reading parts of your book, you seem to have a similar journey.
What was your favorite part of physics?
Well, for me, it was the theoretical physics area, just a lot of the thought experiments. Like I was really into that side of physics, and astrophysics and quantum physics. That was usually, in general, you can say everything that is not really, that is kind of cutting edge, or that is not really fully understood, that grasped my interest. And so that journey I took on.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap for me too.
Yeah, so tell me, I'm super curious. I mean, you're studying flow, you're studying synchronicity, you're a physicist, and I'd love to dive in deeper into that. You wrote a whole book about it. How come that you connected these things, and how come did you have this journey? What's your background beyond physics?
Well, I started early on in my family. My stepfather was a devotee of Sri Swami Satchidananda. And so I learned, just like as infused with the message of yogic philosophy, the Bhagavad Gita and Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And I didn't read those books for a long time until I was in my 20s probably. But I was surrounded by the message that the whole world is a reflection of the inner world. The outer world is a reflection of the inner world. And so that was something I took for granted growing up. And when I got into philosophy as a teenager, I started thinking about stuff differently, started reflecting on my life and who I was and what experiences I had had. And eventually, and especially in my 20s, I started to see synchronicity as like people talked about these experiences they'd had that were sort of spiritual or magical or like life-changing. Could just be, meeting someone in an unusual location, but it's the right person you need to like solve some problem. And, I just saw that there was a connection between that type of experience and this notion of the inner world or the outer world reflecting the inner world. And what I think was motivating for me and frustrating for me is how much people write off those experiences. Like, we sort of separate our minds into two parts, like one that is a human being that has these really amazing, meaningful moments in life where you make a decision that really changes your life in one way or another. Sometimes those are disappointments, right? Like, we don't accomplish something we wanted to, or we miss an opportunity. And sometimes we catch those opportunities in our life, changes in a way that would never changes back to the positive. It goes both ways for me. So noticing those experiences in my life, and that people tend to just not connect that to a scientific worldview. Like, we all rely on our technology, our devices, and our our bus schedules and our cars, and all that is based on science. But then we have this other separated worldview of, like, I'm a human being connected to some kind of deeper spiritual experience, or not. A lot of people don't have that view. And to me, those were integrated into one view of the world. And so when I studied science and physics in college, I started taking classes or just being exposed to stuff that was really inspiring. The first things were like fractals, these repeating patterns of complexity that just went on forever, the notion of infinity, and then Fourier transforms. I'm a musician, and so I discovered that there's this, when you do music and you look at it in the sound domain, the frequency domain, you are converting it from a spatial or a temporal representation, which we're used to, we take for granted. And we're converting it to this other representation of frequencies, where you have the low frequencies like oh, and the high frequencies like ee. And those are separated in space on the screen when you're looking at your computer screen for a given sound, but they represent a timeless or a spaceless view of the sound. And I just saw directly through that into, like, how amazing that was, I guess. And, like, that is much deeper than the textbook is making it out to be. And what I've come to find over 30 years of studying those same ideas more in depth is the really basic notion at the center of my work is the difference between reductionism, which is the idea that we can reduce everything to separate parts, which is what most of science really relies on to draw its conclusions. It's the separation between me and you and subject and object. And holism, which is in our technology, like holograms are an example of holism. And they really connect to this notion in spirituality of oneness or connectedness.
Monism is it called in spirituality? I think a lot of worldviews, it's monism. Isn't it the same? Holism and monism?
I wouldn't say it's the same, but certainly unity or oneness and monism sort of have this notion of one. Monism to me implies, like, not necessarily implies, but for some folks associate that with a God or a separate notion of divinity. And I think we have a tendency to create those things as separate from us. So we're automatically dualistic just in the way we conceive of things. So dealing with oneness is really a personal practice of changing the way that we see the world and the way we form constructs in our head. It's not just like, I'm going to form an idea of what oneness is and talk about that externally, because that's automatically, like, internal and external are still separate. So the Fourier transform showed me, and I think it continues to show the mathematics of how the world can be seen not separated into parts. Because if you take that sound, a waveform in music, and you have the beginning of the song and the end of the song as separate parts in time, in the Fourier transform world, those are not separate pieces of the song. They're mixed together. So there's this automatic holism that shows up when you apply the Fourier transform. And it's present in a lot of physics, actually, but not really recognized.
That would be my next point. Why do you think it's not really recognized, especially among the physicists in general or general public? It's not really. I think it's just started to go into that direction, because I think we have more people from different backgrounds mingling together and probably more information exchange. Why do you feel it's not really recognized?
I think it has to do with history and a lot of complex relationships that have happened between political relationships, between the church and the people, between monarchy and non-monarchy, And that these relationships over history have been embedded in worldview. Like, how do we see the world in terms of power? Who's in power? So it's all tied together. And right now, I know a lot of scientists who hear any talk about synchronicity as laden with spiritual overtones, and that has some motivation to like make you think about God in some particular way. And Richard Feynman, one of my favorite physicists, talked about the mutual pillars of religion and science. He didn't say one was more important than the other, and he talked about them in kind of a way that they need to support each other. And I don't see myself as religious, but I do see myself as very spiritual in a sense of seeking meaning in my life, and that there's something underneath the surface. There's the material world we see, and then there's some kind of guiding information underneath that we don't, or not underneath, but that we don't see. And so I think that we can present it in a new way that doesn't have the implications of the past, which is that, you have to believe it on faith. Like, scientists are afraid that some people are afraid that if you take religion seriously, then there's some things you can't explain and you just take it on faith and you actually suppress scientific reasoning. So we don't want to continue the history of suppression of either types of reasoning. And I think synchronicity is this like connecting point where situations in our lives that everyone's experienced that are meaningful in some surprising way can reflect the inner meaning that we have. So there's a physical aspect and a spiritual, meaningful, informational aspect. And maybe doing that, we can like bring these worlds together in a way that's not cantankerous for either.
Yeah. I feel like quickly back to the worldview. I think it's definitely a big historical background, and I think that shaped the way we look at problems and we look at things. Like you mentioned faith before. What is faith? Faith is you taking something that is or is not, or you believe for granted as it is. I would define faith more or less in that terms. But even in physics, you take also certain theorems as for granted. They're just this is what is right now. So let's build and let's use logic and deduction and try to work with that. Isn't that the case?
Well, the good thing is in science you label those as assumptions in the best case, right? You've got Euclidean geometry is based on certain axioms, and those are understood to be axioms, not provable. Whereas in religion, I think there is a tendency to not necessarily claim the axioms, but to just say that they are truth as they are. And I don't like that personally. What I think happens in science, and this is really the core of how I approach science, is that inevitably in the development of science, in order to make progress, people make assumptions, and they claim those assumptions. They don't cover anything up. That's the beauty of science, is it's not covering anything up. But things do sometimes get buried accidentally because we're all human and society has a process of its own. So, you have people developing, for instance, a theory of how time works, or actually not even developing a theory of how time works, but in order to develop Newtonian mechanics, needing to say what time is, this background clock. And eventually, we knew that was an assumption. And eventually we said, well, Einstein figured out that you can tie space and time together and redefine time in this new way. But there are some things that get buried and we forget our assumptions. And so I'll give an example. The notion that quantum mechanics applies only to the microscopic world. This is a really, really strong conclusion for the majority of scientists, and the majority of lay people too, who read scientific books, believe, based on their reasoning, that quantum mechanics is a theory that applies to microscopic objects. And there's two reasons for this. One, the second is that when we try to design experiments that we've applied to microscopic objects to macroscopic objects, like instead of an electron, we have a molecule, the interference that we see, the quantum effects that we see are less. So there's this decoherence of the interference from quantum mechanics based upon how big it is. So that's evidence that these principles don't apply to the macroscopic world. The first reason why we think that way is because people, I think it might have been von Neumann and others, said we obviously don't see quantum superposition in the macroscopic world. One of the principles of quantum mechanics is that you can have an electron that has an undefined state, meaning it could be over here, could be over here, or it could be spin up, could be spin down. And that's the reality. It's not that one of them is true and we just don't know. The reality is it's a superposition of these two possibilities describing reality. And that's something we don't seem to observe. I'm looking at you and you're where you are, and I know that that's happening. So people said, and literally this is written in textbooks, it's clear and obvious that we don't experience macroscopic superposition in the normal world. So now we have to go about explaining why that is. And the best we've done, it's been very hard because it's not, the laws of quantum mechanics don't say that. They say it applies to everything because it's a linear theory. So if you have one state or two states or 1,000 states or 1 billion states, they can all superimpose. So a big object like you with many molecules could theoretically be superimposed. But the problem is that we don't have a way to understand why that doesn't happen until we come up with this idea of decoherence theory. And decoherence theory is a good theory, and it works. It says that the more objects you have, the more likely it is that they'll choose a single preferred state. And there's statistical reasoning around that. What that misses, it starts with the assumption that we don't experience quantum superpositions. But if you think about what quantum mechanics is, it's the study of what the world is doing when you're not looking at it. So when I'm not looking at an electron, there could be two possibilities. When I'm not looking at you, which I am right now, right? Before we got on the call, from my perspective, I didn't know what your state was. And so theoretically, I could be dealing with a superposition of you. Maybe you weren't going to be able to make the call because you had something come up for you, an emergency. Or maybe you were going to be there. Or maybe there was a technical problem and that we wouldn't show up together. So there's all these possibilities. So maybe we do experience quantum superposition. We just never observe it because we never observe quantum superposition, even in electrons. We look for it carefully with interference experiments. We never actually observe quantum mechanics, except with very carefully designed experiments. So can we design such experiments in the macroscopic world? I don't know. But the key piece is that when you look at the world in a reductionist way, things do cancel out and interference goes away. Quantum mechanics goes away. If you look at the world from a holistic perspective and say that you are an entity as a whole, not breaking you down into pieces and then saying how do they interfere, but you as a whole, how do you interfere with my world? How do you relate to my world? Then that's a actually justifiable way of looking at the world holistically. And from there, this notion of quantum superposition is perfectly legitimate and measurable. I can't say we can experiment and show it directly, but what I try and do theoretically is show that our theories are fully consistent with that. And here's how we need to adjust the underlying assumption that the world is reductionist, which is buried in our mindset and our science.
Yeah, and the way we look at things. Yeah, it's basically two. Could you say it's two ways of operating the brain? Reductionist way or thinking, like separating things and taking everything in.
The one that analyzes and separates. Science is this notion of separating and cutting apart to know something. That's like the left brain, maybe. And the right brain is more synthesizing and seeing the connections between things. One of the ways I demonstrate this in my workshops and lectures is through digital filters. So if you have a photograph or like a video like this, I mean, I'm looking at you on the screen and your camera is actually blurred, pixelated, because they're saving bandwidth, right? It's just a feature of the program. Well, that happens through a filter. That filter does not apply to one pixel at a time. That would be way too much processing. Pixel by pixel, there's 100,000 pixels on the screen. But if you instead convert the picture into the frequency domain, cut out all of the inner frequencies within some region, you're cutting out all the high frequencies. You're cutting out all the details of the picture, where things change really quickly in color. And so it blurs the picture overall. And that is a very quick way to do the math to affect the whole picture at once. You convert it back to the spatial domain, and you have this blurred picture. You did not pay attention to every single pixel. Instead, you holistically altered the image. you made one change that affected all of the picture. So we see this all over the place in technology. And so it makes me think of the left brain and the right brain.
Yeah, the way we are, it's like how I experience this is a lot when I go into deep meditative states, and when I come out of it, how I see and experience the world somehow differently than when I am working very long hours, when I'm working on a project which causes a lot of like rationality, maybe a lot of interactions with people, and then like the world seems to somehow be less bright. I cannot express it differently, but it feels like
There's a filter.
yes, and then you have also the tendency that our brain has a certain momentum. I feel this is my experience at least. If I'm doing one way a long enough time, the brain seems to have a momentum to keep on or apply that filter to reality, to keep on applying this filter to reality, and therefore experiencing it in that way, versus the other way. That's how I experience it sometimes.
Yes, and this notion of digital filters that blur the picture or highlight certain regions and certain qualities of the picture is analogous to, I think, that process of the brain taking in information. When I'm in a state of mind that's feeling defensive or insecure about something I've done or not done, and someone comes to give me a compliment, I might interpret that compliment as a criticism, or I might just miss it altogether, because my mind is not looking for something that reflects that I did a good job. It's actually looking for how did I do a bad job. And so we actually miss and filter out a lot of information. And that's, mindset is so important. One of the things I teach is how to identify the filters that you're operating from, which are really simple. For me, my experience is very simple statements about, what I believe is true about a relationship or about my relationship to people or my job, whatever. And when we identify those filters, we realize, in my experience and the people I've worked with, how much we're seeing everything through those filters. We make choices based on that.
Basically, our beliefs. These are the filters. No.
Yeah, beliefs are filters, exactly. And I think it's really helpful to, I can say that is exactly what a digital filter is doing to a photograph, right? It's removing certain pieces of information systematically so that you don't even know that they were there.
That somehow don't seem relevant for the purpose of that. Yeah, that somehow don't seem relevant. Yeah.
So if you're approaching the world thinking that it's this type of interaction is irrelevant, it's irrelevant to me when somebody gives me positive feedback, because whatever I have to focus on is how I can get better. Then we're missing all the positive feedback because we're starting from the view that it doesn't matter. But if we can see that happening and go, why am I doing that? What's the story for me? What's the deeper belief? Why am I ignoring positive feedback? We can spend some time and think about, what I focus on is the thoughts and the feelings and the body sensations around when that comes up. So noticing some kind of situation where that comes up, and then saying, okay, in this situation where I want to rush on to the next thing without getting positive feedback, what else am I believing? What else am I thinking and feeling? And I might be thinking and feeling, nobody really wants to be my friend. That's something I believe I've had, nobody really wants to be my friend. It's a very simple statement of how I operate in the world. And it makes me distrust positive feedback. So it's leading to this other behavior of not staying available when people give me compliments. So our beliefs can lead to behaviors in really predictable ways, sort of scientifically. You can predict that when this type of trigger happens, I'll probably respond by moving on to the next thing and rushing away from the compliment. And when we see that happening, this is the key for me, is like not trying to change it, just trying to see it. Once you realize you're looking through a filter, you start to see what's beyond the filter and go like, well, I can choose now. I don't have to be different. I don't have to convince myself that people do want to be my friend, but I can start to say, well, that doesn't make any sense. And then my logical brain can take over and say, here's a better, more accurate picture of the world. a lot of people do want to be my friend, and they're giving me feedback.
Yeah, the first step is basically becoming aware of that filter that you have, which is usually subconscious. Usually you're not really aware of it, and through your questioning, through your method.
And we can make it conscious. And synchronicity is the way that the universe, in my experience, gives us situations to make those thoughts more conscious. So we're going to keep showing up in situations where we're cheated or complimented, or people breaking up with us from relationships, or we get fired from our job, or we get hired into a job that's too much for us. Whatever the situation is that triggers those unconscious beliefs, it'll probably keep happening. And I would call that synchronicity. It's a way that the universe is built to help us uncover those subconscious beliefs so we can make more accurate sense of the world and feel better.
So you're different. Let's bring the conversation towards the synchronicity. That's really where I want to deep dive. How would you define synchronicity? As a confirmation of your filters, or?
Yeah, let me give you an example. A synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence. Put it that way. That was Carl Jung's way of talking about it. And there are different ways of thinking about synchronicity. Carl Jung talked about dreams and how they relate to your real life, but I really focus on situations. Like what happened to you that somebody else could observe and verify that to you was meaningful in a way that seems hard to like justify with just saying it was random. There was something about it that was like spooky and unlikely. So I'll give an example. I was intentionally trying to get to some of those internal messages around me and music. I've been a musician my whole life. I have some stage fright, some self-consciousness around it. And I'm a really good, experienced musician. So it's like frustrating to be stuck in some of those patterns when I know that I'm good enough to do what I do. So I was invited to go to my cousin's house to play music. And it was a Halloween party. And I was going to be the piano player for the party. But I also knew that this was like a rager Halloween party. And I was very insecure about showing up and just playing a piano. Like, it's not going to fit the vibe. But I also, and this is one of the things I do with synchronicity, is I try to say yes. Because I saw that this was clearly an invitation that came to me purposefully from my cousin I trust that it's there to help me grow in the way that I'm really thinking about at that moment. There was an alignment between my current process of like trying to learn about getting more confident with music and being asked to play for a party. So I went to the party and I showed up and I was immediately, intimidated because there's like people in costumes spilling out the door, and I walk in the room and there's a small piano against the wall, like not even set up or anything. And so I immediately went to the bathroom and like had a little panic attack and I called my wife and was like, if I just leave and go home, I probably will stop halfway and be like, I should go back to the party. Oh, I'll probably get stuck in like indecision. And the best thing for me to do is just stay here, find a way to like drop into my confidence or my core self and like do what I came to do. And that was a really scary thought, but I knew it was the best possible choice because otherwise I'd be stuck just feeling bad about myself all night. So I opened the door to step out of the bathroom and head towards the piano and bump into one of my good friends from elementary school who did not know my cousin, as far as I was aware. So I walk into him and I'm like, what are you doing here, Gene? And immediately I felt more connected to the party, right? These are not strangers. These are like my people, even if I don't know most of them. And another friend was there. They're in a band together. So they're both musicians. I spent, decades with them growing up. We played some music together. I felt totally supported at that point, and I could do what I had to do to show up and feel like I belonged in that place and play music. So how did Gene show up at that party? I have no idea how he knows John, my cousin. They're both involved in the scene locally, doing stuff like that, but I had no idea that they were connected. And that timing of meeting him at the party was so helpful to me for accomplishing what I had wanted to do in my evening. So that's a synchronicity. It's really unusual that even at that moment and that party, all those things lined up for me to run into him. It was just a minute, 60 seconds of time between me walking out of the bathroom and going to the piano. Like, that's the moment when I ran into him. So how do we describe that without resorting to faith, right? Without resorting to like some external consciousness that wanted to make that happen for me, or me like controlling him and pulling him into my orbit or something like that. I think those are the things that turn us away from really integrating the spiritual experience that I had that night into a scientific worldview. So what I do is I look at the physics that we have, and it does align with this notion of multiple possibilities in the multiverse. You look at you're experiencing not just a single world, but it's a tree. That's the picture that comes from quantum mechanics, is a tree, a branching tree of possibilities. And this is not controversial if you're talking about an electron. You've got a tree of how it evolves under every measurement. When you talk about my friend Gene, that's obviously controversial because he's a big object that doesn't supposedly obey quantum mechanics. But if you allow that to be the case, as I sort of argued earlier, then you would say, well, Gene has many different possible states. One, he's at the party. Another, he's not at the party. And another, he doesn't even know John, my cousin. So there's all these possibilities based on history, right? And I'm interacting with that tree of possibilities. And I like to think of it as an apple tree. So somewhere up there is an apple. And my apple is like some situation happens where I feel good about the night. Feel more confident, whatever it is that's going on for me. I feel like I've succeeded at what I've tried to do. And the apple is like weighing down the branch. There's many ways that could happen. So those apples are at the top of the tree, weighing down those possibilities, making it more likely that something lower down on the tree will happen to get me there. And so one of those possibilities is Gene shows up. And that's not actually the outcome that I'm after, but it's helping me get to the outcome I'm after. So it's a situation. The synchronicity is like something that happens along the way to help us get what we're trying to get to. And this tree idea is helpful because there's some branches of the tree where Gene doesn't show up in my world, and there's no synchronicity. And on those branches, it's less likely that I get to the apple and feel good about my night and stay at the party.
So why did you experience that one branch of the tree? Just probability? How would you say?
Right. That's exactly a great question. So leading up to that night, I had actually done a number of things previous weeks to sort of continue this search for more comfort in my performances. And like even earlier that day, I had been spontaneously invited to a jam with my dad. And I went to a barn out in the country and a bunch of acoustic music going on. And I played some songs, and it helped me get settled in like who I was, and my body feeling calm and like focusing on the music and not my own, inner process. And so I felt like good going when I showed up at John's house from that experience. I had invested some momentum and built momentum towards what I wanted to experience. I call this anticipated qualitative experience. The qualitative experience I wanted to have was something like feeling more happy with my experience playing music, feeling less tension, less self-consciousness, less stress, more confident. So again, it's a qualitative experience, right? It's not I want to get paid for this gig. It's I want to feel a certain way. I'm anticipating that. And the way that I'm anticipating that is by doing stuff which gets me closer to that, or is meaningfully related to that, like going to my dad's house and playing music. So what I suggest when we try to court more synchronicity is to do things, even if you don't know what the outcome or the direction is really leading towards, do things that reflect what you want to accomplish or experience. It doesn't really matter what you do as long as you start doing it. Pick up a book, start reading about it. Sit down at your computer and do some research or write some emails to people you know. Just start the process of gathering information or putting out feelers or develop your book idea or whatever it is. start working on writing an hour a day if you want to be an author. Like, don't worry about who you're sending it to. Just start doing the practice that brings you some momentum. And as you build momentum, you're moving along that tree towards more apples, because the apples are in the future, they're weighing down from the future, they're weighing down those possibilities and making it more likely that you have situations that pull you there. And so eventually I'm at the party and I've built some momentum. I've made it really clear what it is that I want to experience. And I've also been really clear with like what my obstacle is. I'm scared. And then the synchronicity happens, which is exactly the right thing to help me get to the next apple. I run into Gene. I feel like I've got a friend here. I can breathe deeper. I'm good. Let's have some fun. Shifted my mindset. So by doing work, taking action, we build momentum towards those apples that we ourselves have defined.
And in that way, we are influencing reality, you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah. This notion of the multiverse is saying that there's many realities, many possible physical ways the world can happen. They're not all actually happening. It's all from a subjective view. This is my experienced reality, and there's all these possible realities in the future. And we are influencing the direction that we go along that tree. And what I love about this model is it gets us a little bit away from the notion that we're like defining our reality or creating our reality. We are statistically influencing the likelihood of a specific path along the tree. It doesn't mean that we're creating every situation at all. And a lot of what I think is the wisdom that can come out of this is how we deal with things that we don't create. How do we respond in ways that don't, through our filters, don't perpetuate the same thing we're trying to avoid? Part of the trick of what goes on in our lives.
That we don't want to create, but probably still.
Yeah, when we react to things, we tend to, in my experience, go from some kind of filter that's making the wrong sense of the situation. Like if somebody, gives me a feedback on a song that I just played, I'm going to hear that, because if I'm feeling like nervous and insecure, I'm going to hear that as like, I should have done something different. And I can't hear something positive. So we are influencing the direction that we move along that tree. And therefore, what synchronicities come next. And those synchronicities are going to reflect our own inner feeling, our anticipated qualitative experience.
And what role does flow play into this?
I realized as I was trying to make sense of, why is this important to me in my life, that what I get from the experience of paying attention to synchronicity is I get into flow. So I couldn't have predicted what it would take for me to sit down at that piano that night. But by being receptive to my intuition to go to the bathroom first and just be quiet for a minute, take some space, and then to just be courageous enough to go through with my plan and run into Gene at that moment, like that is not at all on the radar for what I thought was going to happen. And so flow is what emerges when we let go of control. These are Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's words. We let go of the notion of trying to control or not control. We don't actually let go of control. We let go of the worry about control. We're no longer focused on, is this my job to fix this or to choose something? We drop into more of a relationship. So we let go of the worry about whether we're in control. And then we're able to show up and take initiative, or let other people take initiative and be more receptive, depending on whatever is needed, whatever we feel is needed. And that's flow. So I was available when I walked out of the bathroom and saw Gene. Like, I was able to notice that made me feel more comfortable. It was helpful to me. I was happy to see him. I stayed and talked to him for a few minutes, and that was actually helpful to feel better. I might have missed that if I had not been paying attention to the synchronicity, and I would have missed that flow. So a lot of people talk about flow as being letting go of, control and just giving it up to God or something. And I see it much more as a proactive responsiveness between the cosmos and ourselves.
So you give up basically the desire of a certain outcome. You listen to your intuition. You listen to whatever comes along, so whatever synchronicity comes along, but you're not you're not making your feeling or your experience or how you look at the experience so much dependent on what the outcome is. Could you say that?
Yeah, there's a really important piece from yogic philosophy here around non-attachment or detachment, or Buddhist philosophy as well, which I think you're referring to or alluding to. It's not that we give up on the goal. As you said, we give up on the attachment to the goal. And for me, this is a really beautiful thing about the universe that I think is the way it works. It often gives us what it is that we're after, our anticipated qualitative experience, but it does it in a way that's unpredictable and often looks different than we expected. And I think that's because in a chaotic world where there's just so much happening, the way we're able to experience these positive experiences or anticipated experiences is through the unpredictable mixing of our world with other people. So if I want to experience, a new relationship, there's no way to just go to the market and pick out a new relationship, right? It's like I've got to deal with the actual tree of possibility. Who's around me? Who am I going to connect to? Who's possible to connect with? And from that, it's not going to necessarily look like what I imagined. But if you look a little more carefully, you might find that it has all the qualities that you were really after. And that's why knowing what our filters are is really important or helpful. Because if I realize I'm not after someone who has a certain amount of money or certain status, I'm after an experience of feeling loved and cared for, you're going to notice that more readily when it comes, not be turned off by the filter of what they look like or sound like or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Is that like, have you come across a lot of physicists or scientists and philosophers? Well, in let's say Eastern philosophy, probably yes, probably more. But have you come across any notable scientists talking about this in one way or another, or mentioning this?
Well, I mean, this is a few things we've talked about. There's synchronicity, there's holism.
Synchronicity, for example, and flow. Flow, Mikael, she sent me her, but like these connections, and particularly synchronicity. You mentioned Freud, I think, in the beginning.
I mentioned Jung, Carl Jung has seen.
Young, yes.
And Jung and Wolfgang Pauli had a relationship looking at synchronicity, because Pauli had a lot of experiences in dreams and also in real life that he was like couldn't make sense of, that seemed meaningful in the arc of his life. So he believed a lot of what Jung was saying about archetypes and the messages we can get from both dreams and sort of waking dreams, like strange coincidences. And from what I understand, Pauli, I think he got the Nobel Prize for his work on the exclusion principle for fermions, that no two electrons can be in the same state, which gives rise to electronic structure and atoms chemistry. And I think he was known for being not just a bad experimentalist, but like a cursed experimentalist. Like he would walk into the room of an experimenter's lab and stuff would break. That was sort of the theory about Pauli. Like there's a story about one experimentalist whose experiment went strangely wrong and couldn't figure out why this device broke. And then he found out that Pauli was in town to visit him the next day and was like, oh, now I know why that happened. So, I just a funny story. That's not the kind of thing that I like put my faith in as like a repeatable, but I do think it influenced Pauli to, really want to understand these experiences and work with Jung on some development of that. And their approach was to look at things like complementarity, the wave-particle duality, the notion that there are two different complementary ways of looking at certain things. That's very similar to the reductionist holistic model that I'm talking about. And another person is David Bohm. David Bohm was a well-respected, in some ways, physicist. He was at the height of the Cold War, and he was blacklisted for being a communist sympathizer. And his life his academic career was really unfairly cut short as a result of political issues. But he was a great physicist. He developed the Bohm-Aharonov effect and many other things. And he wrote a book called Wholeness with some subtitle. He really initiated this research into holism and in the Fourier transform as a really important clue as to what's going on underneath the surface, that there's an alternative to reductionism. So I recommend that book. And he's one of the guys that really got me started thinking about this.
I wasn't aware of that book. I have to definitely check it out. That's it's very interesting. I didn't know about him talking about it.
He calls it the implicate order. He says that there's the explicate order, which is like obvious to us. It's this microphone and this room, what we can see. The implicate order is enfolded into that, and you can't see it. But the explicate order unfolds out of the implicate, right? Similar to the way that one branch of the tree that you actually experience unfolds out of the many possible branches that you can never see. And this really influenced my thinking around using Fourier transforms as a way to describe quantum physics fundamentally, and this notion of the underlying hidden reality that can't be directly sensed, and then the explicate reality that you can actually measure.
Which we are experiencing in our subjective world.
And the way you measure it is by interference of timelines and possibilities that might show up as synchronicity. Like that's the connection that I make to it.
Okay. Basically, when you have this just one understanding here, the branch there are infinite branches, aren't there, or are they just finite branches?
Well, there's a lot of branches. I don't think there's infinite anything, because that word doesn't really make sense. Because from here, there are only certain things that can happen, right? I'm in San Francisco. I can't be in New York 5 minutes from now. That branch doesn't exist for me. If I name one thing that can't be true, then it's not an infinite, right? So there's an ever increasing number of possibilities. But I think it's useful to realize it's not infinite. And what we can do is become more honest about what is possible, and how does synchronicity like actually practically help us get to something useful.
So it's like this electron cloud, which we are measuring, or like it's comparable to the electron cloud. The electron is very improbable to be super far away from the core. There's a cloud. There's a region where probability is higher. On the same way, you could say there's a branch cloud.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. I hadn't thought of that. There are certain branches. I mean, I could be in New York, by tonight, but that's a very distant branch. Like that would involve me getting off the phone right now and getting in the car and going to the airport and buying a last minute ticket and getting on the plane like immediately. And that's possible, but that branch is like way out there in the electron cloud. But it's helpful to look at it that way, because you realize there is more possible than I give myself credit for on my everyday habits, because I don't think about I could just do that right now. When we do that kind of thing, take bold steps like that, I think we give more opportunity for synchronicity to show up.
It's I love the way you're describing it. It's very appealing to me. It's like with the way of the branches, and it seems that's fascinating. Would you like, since we're almost at an end, and I think I could talk about this really, I could deep dive about this for hours. What would you give people as an advice to kind of sum it up, maybe a little bit, of how to live more in these flow states, or how to listen more to these synchronicities? You kind of scratched on that already, but you mentioned also the way, I'm not sure if you used the word, but the way you feel about things. What role does that play, and just some general advice on based on what you found.
Yeah, the tool that I put in the Living in Flow book is I call the Lorax, LORRAX. Listen to whatever's going on. Open your mind. Reflect on it. Release your attachments to how you thought it was supposed to be, and then act. Do something about that. And the X stands for like don't give up when it doesn't happen the way you expect. go back to the L again and start over, listen to life. So if I give this example of like, I could be in New York by nightfall, and I open my mind, like I listen to the desire that I have to do that. Go like, I do actually want to do that. I'm telling myself it's impossible or it's too expensive or whatever, but check in, like get the filters out of the way. That's not reasonable. That's not responsible. Just get those filters out of the way. What do I want? What I want is to go to New York tonight. Wow, that's powerful. That's my anticipated qualitative experience. And then I'm going to open my mind to that by like getting past those filters. And then I'm going to reflect, how could I do that? I could go to the airport right now and I could pack a backpack. What if I don't have the money? Well, I can bring my wallet and see what happens when I get there. Like getting those no statements out of your head just to see what is possible on those branches, and release the attachment to like, well, I was going to work on my reports tonight at home, or I was going to go see a friend. Well, I'm going to let go of that so I can follow this new path and then I take action on it, do something. In this case, I would go to the airport, right, and maybe find that there is a flight. Maybe I'm on the train to get to the airport, and I realize there's a better flight from a different airport, so I switch trains, and information will come to me along the way because I've initiated this process. I've listened, I've opened, I've reflected, I've acted, I've released, and I've acted. And now I'm paying attention and dynamically responding to the information that comes, and maybe find a flight that's a good one for me. Maybe someone cancels their ticket at the last minute and there's a space available. All of these things are what we have to trust will unfold. This is kind of where faith comes in. But it's faith not based on an externalization of God, but on the commitment that we made to get to our goal, trusting that on that tree of possibilities, there will be something that will help us do that. And it's all connected, reasonably through scientific reasoning and causality, but it's more possibilities than we could have expected. So from that boldness, following the Lorax, to pay attention and listen to our life, get our filters out of the way, we are able to then experience helpful synchronicities, which allow us to get there. That would be the summary of how I think synchronicity can actually change.
Lorax, listen. Can you just repeat Lorax?
Listen, open your mind, reflect, release, act,
and repeat,
and don't give up. Repeat.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can tell you times when I've been to the airport and I've thought I was going to get it, make it happen, and I didn't make it happen, and the plane left without me, and then I almost give up, and then something else unfolds, and I still get to what I want to experience, even if it's not the way I thought it was going to happen.
So what can you learn out of this? Like if you take this Lorax in and apply it to your day-to-day life, you can learn that basically there's like neglect or like become first aware of your limiting beliefs that limit maybe your experience and your reality and hold you back in some way.
I think the most useful piece from exactly what you said, yes, become aware of your limiting beliefs, and then recognize how from those beliefs we tend to create and recreate problems for ourselves through the reactions that we have. So synchronicity really is a guide for learning about ourselves, because the situations we experience are going to reflect us back to ourselves. Not that we create every experience or every experience is good in some way. We deal with things that are unfair or traumatic also. But ultimately, in whatever cases we're able to, coming back to a sense of self-empowerment. What does this show me about myself and how I can respond differently to thrive in my life?
Increasing self-awareness through that. Beautifully said. I like that. Sky, thank you for that. Let's wrap it up. Where can people find more about you and your books? Where would you point them towards? Where can they read your stuff about you?
You can find my workshops. I give workshops periodically and courses, and my books as well are available through the synchronicityinstitute.com website. That's the Synchronicity Institute. And that's my organization. And the books are available in bookstores. So if you want to find Living in Flow or my second book, Leap to Wholeness, go to your local bookstore, ask for it.
Amazing. We'll put all the links in the show notes. So thank you, Sky. Amazing.
Thank you, Flo. It's been a delight. And thanks for going into some cool conversations that don't come up a lot.